When blood starts running out of the taps in horror movies, it usually comes in torrents. Big, powerful streams of liquid in bright fire engine red that you know is supposed to be blood actually looks nothing like it, because for one thing, it's far too red, and for another, it stains the sink it's pouring into, because it's mostly made up of food coloring. When it happens for real, it's nothing like that. Of course, before I moved into the new house, I had checked the taps. Going through my checklist of things to be sure of before I signed the lease, I tried every tap in the kitchen and bathroom, checking for leaks or any water damage, and making sure that both the temperature and pressure were okay. The last thing I wanted was to move in and then find that the water came out in a dribble, or that I wouldn't be able to have a hot shower. At first, the taps seemed reluctant. They coughed and spluttered, as if trying to clear their airways, stuttering jets of water out the way all plumbing systems will if you leave them unused for a while. Eventually, though, they started running normally. The water was clear, the hot tap turned it to a pleasing skin-scalding temperature, and the pressure was great. I ticked it off my list and moved on thinking that there would be no problems. For the first week that we lived in the apartment, there wasn't. It was at the start of the second week that I started to hear the drip, a constant repetitive noise that, despite being just a single droplet of water hitting the inside of the sink, somehow managed to ring and resonate loudly through the entire place. At first I tried to ignore it, but you know what it's like. As soon as you actually notice something like that, it suddenly becomes all you can hear. The next morning, I woke up early, and the first thing I set out to do was to fix that stupid tap. I walked into the bathroom already armed with a spanner. What made me curious, however, was that the space directly below the tap, where the drip had been hitting the porcelain, had left a mark. A small patch of rust-coloured gunk sitting inside a larger corona of thin, crimson liquid. At first I assumed it must be rust from inside the pipes. Best looking more closely, I immediately began to suspect that it was what I thought it was. Blood. I ran the tap to see what the water quality was like, and the stain immediately began to wash away, the coagulated pile thinning as the warm water hit it and draining away. The water was clear, perfectly fine and without any trace of pollutants. I tightened the nut on the tap and the larger bolt under the sink and assumed the problem would be fixed. That night, the drip came again. Slow and consistent, like someone tapping a fingernail onto the surface of porcelain. Drip, drip, drip. This time, I got up from bed and went into the bathroom, upset that my efforts tightening the bolts had not helped. What I saw, suspended from the end of the tap and ready to fall, was a single droplet of what looked to be bright red blood. It did not drip. Instead, it hung there, suspended like some tiny ruby-coloured fruit, swollen and plump, threatening at any second to fall, and yet not. It was strange, but it seemed like it was hanging there on purpose, as if it was waiting for me. I stepped into the bathroom itself and watched the droplet fall as I expected it might. What I did expect was that it would scream when it landed. Whether the voice came from the droplet, from the plug hole, or the tap itself, I'm not sure, but the screech made me jump out of my skin. It was a female voice, screaming in fear or agony or both. I remember I jumped backwards and watched as the single drop was followed by another, and then another, until a long stream of blood was leaking out from the tap, tumbling down in a bright red stream, and as the amount grew larger, the speed of the flow quicker, the voice became louder and louder, wailing and crying so loud that I saw my neighbours' lights flick on, as they were disturbed by the cries. Terrified, I ran from the room and out into the shared hallway, where a bunch of my neighbours, clutching robes and half-dressed in their pyjamas, were standing in the doorways of their own apartments, eyeing me suspiciously. The following day, I called the estate agent, the building supervisor, and the company responsible for the plumbing. I was told that the water supply, as was often the case in this country, was supplied by an enormous water tank on the roof. According to the guy from the company, the most likely cause of blood coming through the taps was that a bird or something else had fallen into the water tank and the blood was coming through over time. He said this in a really offhand way, as if I hadn't been bathing in that water for over a week by this point. Luckily, I only drank bottled water, but I did use it for things like brushing my teeth, and the thought of using water polluted by a dead bird or something else made me feel ill. As it turned out, it was something else. Amelia Tan was a young woman who up until around 5 years earlier had lived in an apartment across the street, right up until the day she went missing. When the enormous water tank on the roof was opened up, she was finally found, or at least her bones were. They had been stripped of their meat, likely using a strong acid. The bones had been moved here and dumped in the water tank as a hiding place. Whilst this in itself is hideously disturbing, what unsettled me most was the fact that this didn't really explain the issue. Emilia's bones did not have skin, blood vessels, veins or muscles. Her body had already been stripped of anything that could have caused blood to leak from the taps, but then, if it hadn't, her remains would never have been found. As for the voice and the screaming, the engineer said this was probably an effect caused by a piece of bone getting stuck in the pipe and the pressure building up to create some kind of whistling effect. That was his explanation, but neither I nor any of my neighbors believed it. What the soil keeps secret, what his mother still knows not, is 'neath the wych elm marked in red, the August boy still rots. I found those words the very first week after moving into my new house. I say I found them, but really it was Mark. He had found the words written, or rather scratched, either with a knife or some other sharp-pointed tool, into the underside of one of the floorboards. I had moved into the house about a month earlier, and Mark was helping me to remodel the living room, part of which involved redoing the floor, which itself involved pulling up the old knackered boards and relaying the floor with hardwood panel. Mark found the message on the underside of the very first floorboard he pulled up. I remember him prying the thing loose with a chisel and the back end of a claw hammer, before lifting it and looking at closely as if he'd found something important. For a second I thought he'd spotted damp or mold or something and panicked, because I thought he was going to tell me the house had a problem. Instead, he lifted the board up to eye level and read the little poem aloud. When he turned back to look at me, there was a weird, empty look in his eyes that I didn't recognize. At the time, I wasn't sure what that look was supposed to express, but looking back now, I can see that he was totally creeped out. Not that I can blame him. I mean, it's not the sort of secret message you want to find lurking beneath the floorboards of your new place, is it? Especially when it's not the only one. Having read the message aloud and had his little creeped out moment, Mark tossed it aside and started pulling at another board, which eventually came loose. He was about to toss that one onto the same pile when he stopped. Shaking his head, he again read aloud. Around a grave and empty box, the family stands and weeps, never to know that 'neath the oak, their April boy still sleeps. This time the expression on Mark's face was less hard to read. He read the words again, with a bitter curl of the lip, and tossed it aside. What the hell is this crap? Is there going to be one on all of these? He said this, gesturing to the 30 or more floorboards yet to be pulled up. I shrugged and shook my head. If I'm honest, at that point I neither knew nor cared. I just wanted the job done so I could get on with the next stage. Mark, though, was fascinated. With every board he pulled out, he would find and read aloud a new little poem. After the third one, he became more protective of the boards, piling them neatly rather than just chucking them in the corner, and asked after, around the 15th one, whether he could keep them. You never know, they might be worth something, these. I mean, you don't know who lived here before you. What if it was some famous poet or writer or something, and this is like a lost work? You need to check this sort of stuff out. I told him he could check out all he wanted, but since the house had been empty for about 5 years before I moved in, even the estate agent didn't know who had it before me. He was welcome to look though, and he could keep the boards as long as he helped me lay the new hardwood, and bought me a pint to pay for the floorboards later. He shook his head and laughed, but he did take the boards away with him. We didn't end up going to the pub that night. Instead, around an hour before we were supposed to leave, Mark was at my door looking white as a sheet, with a policeman standing beside him. He explained that he had been on the internet to see if he could find any information about who lived in my new house before me. At first, he didn't come up with anything interesting. The house had last been occupied by a woman called Anne Loomis, who had died around 5 or 6 years earlier. He found this out because she had been in the local newspaper complaining about something to do with the bus route. There had been a photograph of her, and the article mentioned that she had lived at 47 Maple Street, my new house, for 20-odd years. But now, with the changes to the bus times, she would be unable to get into town. It was all very dull. No great poet, no famous artist, and no explanation of the strange boards. Until that was. Mark put the words for the first little poem into Google. Then something altogether more sinister came back. It was a photograph of a man named Bernard Wiltz. The photograph showed him, standing in front of the wall of his prison cell, where the very same words were etched in huge letters onto the wall. The small amount of information linked to the photograph said that Wiltz was a serial killer, and around 20 years ago had murdered 3 young boys, and claimed to have killed many more, though their bodies had never been found. Their families never given the comfort of burying the victim properly. It was only as Mark stared at the image of Wiltz that he made a connection nobody previously had. He noticed that in his sloping forehead, deep-set eyes and heavy jowled cheeks, Bernard Wiltz looked remarkably similar facially to the photograph old Mrs. Loomis. A quick scan of the town registrar's office confirmed that Loomis was Anne's married name. Her maiden name was Wiltz. She was Bernard's twin sister. Feeling there must be more to this than coincidence, Mark decided to investigate further and found that before his arrest, Bernard had lived around 15 miles away from Anne in another town. It was in that town that the bodies of his 3 victims had been discovered, buried under the roots of long-standing trees. Other trees in the area were checked, but no other remains found. But of course, the trees were never checked in the town where Bernard's sister lived. The town where Bernard may very well have helped to lay the floorboards in his sister's house, where he may have written his gloating confessions, and where wych elm, oak, birch and maple trees still stood in significant points. So far the police have discovered 4 bodies, the boys Bernard referred to in his poems as August, March, May and June. There were 32 boards with poems in total, pulled up from my front room. Whether 32 boards means 32 boys, we don't know. For now, the police keep digging. I haven't yet worked up the courage to check the other rooms.